Once again, it's very good to have all of you in assembly with us for our Bible class time as we're going through our study of the Gospel according to John. We are in verse 25, where John is being called to give an account. There are those that are sent from Jerusalem, Levites, priests, asking John, "Who art thou?" We already went through a discussion about they already knew full well who John was because of who his parents are, the circumstances that are centered around his birth and the miraculous events that took place there. And that as John then gave a record, verse 20, he confessed and denied not, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." They asked him, "What then? Art thou Elias?" He saith, "I am not." "Art thou that prophet?" And he answered, "No." And we made the point on how it is by them asking the kind of questions that they're asking, the answers that John is giving, what it is that they are understanding about the time and the circumstances centered around John's birth. You're asking about the Christ. You're asking about the Messiah. You're asking about Elijah. You're asking about that prophet from Deuteronomy 15. So you're ultimately telling on yourself on what it is that you are in full expectation of. This is the time that all of the Old Testament prophets have been pointing towards, and that of the coming Messiah. So that when Jesus then steps on the scene, they should have been ready to receive him. This is already on your mind. You're already thinking about it. By you questioning John about these things proves that. And we already discussed about John's responses, his answering no to these identities, and how that this group that is being sent to John, verse 24 tells us, "And they which were sent were of the Pharisees." Now, when we get to verse 25, we have some more discussion and some more insight as to what they are interested about in these events. They asked him and said unto him, "Why baptizest thou then, if thou be not that Christ, nor Elijah, neither that prophet?" There are some things to consider if we are going to be able to appreciate the question that they're raising at this point, and that's specifically about his baptizing. The Pharisees had a huge problem with this baptism. And not only the Pharisees, but the Sadducees for that matter as well, because they denied anything of the spiritual realm. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in the demonic presences and the resurrection of the soul. They didn't believe in that either. So they would take issue with this because this is the events that are setting up for the new birth, that inner man that's going to be born again. And when we're thinking about why it is that the Pharisees would have an issue with this baptizing that John is doing, is because that John's baptism was a baptism of repentance. For what reason? For the remission of sins. So you put that into the mind of a Pharisee, and what's his viewpoint on sin?
He has none.
Okay, he has none. I'm a Jew. I'm a child of Abraham. I am perfectly fine where I'm needing to be. So John's baptism, and so even with that, we reference it as John's baptism, and we understand what we mean by that. But this is, in fact, something that's being designated by God. That's the very question that Jesus raises to the Pharisees when they ask him about what authority he has to cleanse the temple. He in turn says, "Well, I'll answer your question if you answer mine." And the question was centered around what? All right, John's baptism. And what specifically of it? What about it?
Is it man or is it of God?
All right, is it from men or is it of heaven? So while we reference this as John's baptism, this is a heavenly given ordinance. a command given by God. You need to go through this.
Just like when we say Moses' law.
Right.
We all know what that means.
Exactly. Exactly. So the law was given by Moses, but who gave the law to Moses? God did. So it's synecdoche. Synecdoche. I don't say that enough. I need to start saying it more. I'm having a hard time pronouncing it. It's a part. It's a part for the whole. Now, when we're digging deeper into some of the issues that the Pharisees and different ones, the Jews in particular, are going to have about this matter. Now, it's true that the Jews had certain washings under the Old Testament system. Hebrews 9, verse 10, the Hebrew writer tells us, which stood only in meats and drinks, speaking of that Old Testament system, and diverse washings and cardinal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. There were some carnal ordinances and some carnal washings that were put into place. And somewhere along the line in Jewish history, the Jews began implementing an immersion on Gentiles so as to make them full proselytes into Judaism. Now, it's going to be one of those things that's going to fall under these carnal ordinances. You're not going to find it in the Old Testament because what they're implementing was not implemented by God. Under the Old Testament system, if somebody is wanting to be a full proselyte, you're a Gentile, you're wanting to be brought into the Old Testament system so as to be able to observe Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Harvest, so on and so forth. What do you have to do? Circumcision. That's what's given to Abraham. You be circumcised, you circumcise your children, you circumcise all your servants. They're not having to be immersed so as to be brought into that. And even under the law of Moses, that's not found. But what you do find from secular history is that there are the earliest references to Jewish proselyte baptism date to the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Mishnah, and the Mishnah is simply an edited record of the complex body of material known as the Oral Torah. So it's not those things that are written down in the law of Moses, it's the things that are being spread by word of mouth. So things that are not in the law, but these are things that are being said about the law. So the Mishnah, in the earliest code of Jewish law, there's a discussion of the requirements for conversion to Judaism. Among these requirements is immersion in a mikvah or a ritual bath. It is unclear when baptism of proselytes became a common practice. In the Talmud is the term for the documents that comment on the Mishnah. So it's like we have the Bible, and if we want to get some more information, we might go to some commentaries. That's what the Talmud is. Talmud is a commentary on this. Neither one of these is actually doctrinal.
What's the Mishnah again?
The Mishnah is the oral records.
Of law of Moses?
Well, not just the law of Moses.
What they also imposed.
Yeah, what they also began to impose.
Yes, so it became their own
Right,
thing.
right.
A creed.
Yeah. So this would be similar to like the Samaritans. The Samaritans actually had their own Bible alongside of what real Jews had. It's I believe it's the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is their version of the first 5 Old Testament books. But we know those books are not genuine because they have altered certain passages that fit into their group of people. So for example, Deuteronomy says that Moses says to the people, God is going to establish a place where He's going to place His name, and that's where you come to worship, you bring your offerings, and you bring your tithes. All right? Where did that end up being? It ends up being Jerusalem. In the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's not Jerusalem. It ends up being, I can't remember where they end up placing it, but it's somewhere in that Samaria region up in the north. But they wanted to hold on to that as though, well, no, this is what God gave to Moses. That's the reason why you have in John chapter 4, when we get there, the Samaritan woman at the well, what's the question she asks Jesus about?
You are a prophet.
All right? She says, you're a prophet, but then she asks,
Where to worship?
huh?
Where to worship?
Okay. You say we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem, but our fathers say we worship over here. Now, where'd she get that? She got it from the Samaritan Pentateuch, their version of the Bible. So even during those days, you have alterations in versions, so that shows you some danger about once you start getting too many versions of the book out there. All right? So good question. Hopefully we didn't lose anybody in that. So in the Talmud, there's discussion of when baptism is required, and the answer seems to be that it is not required for every proselyte, but only for those who come from a background of idol worship. It's possible that the custom of baptism for converts to Judaism developed in response to the needs of specific groups of converts. So the Mishnah, that earliest record of this Jewish law, coming about in the 1st and 2nd century, but the Talmud does not come into existence until after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that's the commentary on these things. So where this exactly came about, with all the research I was able to do, nobody's able really to pinpoint it. But it came about during during this time frame. But it's with that understanding that we can then get a further glimpse as to why these individuals had the problem with John baptizing. Because here's John preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. The Jews have wrongfully gone about in establishing a method so as to convert a proselyte. So can we then see the connection that they're building up in their own brain because of this carnal tradition that they've brought about? Here's John preaching this baptism for the remission of sins, baptism of repentance for the remission of sins, and the Jews have established their own form of baptism, but who's it for? No.
Gentiles.
It's for Gentiles. Yeah, to create Jews. Now here's John, and he's preaching the same message, and who's he preaching it to?
The Jews.
To the Jews. So they have created their own stumbling block to where they come along and they're saying, you're baptizing these Jews, but this is something that we've set up for Gentiles. Now, it's a stumbling block, but in reality, it's just setting up for what's coming in the future. What is it that's going to be the redemption element for both Jew and Gentile after the day of Pentecost? Baptism in water for the remission of sins. So all of this is in preparatory work so as to get everybody ready for this. But because of what they've done and going beyond what God had actually ordained and established, they further cut their knees out from under them.
I'm just going to ramble a little bit, but it's kind of interesting because you always, when you don't know the history and you know that water is precious, you know that water is the cleansing agent for so many things.
Yeah.
But establishing why baptism, why is this so necessary? This is very interesting in the sense that knowing this secular history aspect, and just how God used this, because you always wonder, why baptism? It's always been kind of a, not a stumbling block, but why?
Yeah.
And to know that he used it and just the circumstances surrounding it that the Pharisees were already doing, not authorized by God, but then here comes God and saying, I am authorizing. It's just interesting how it all kind of tightens the net a little bit more. It makes it a little bit clearer, because I think also, possibly the denominational aspect right now.
Yeah.
Why baptism?
Right.
Why do I have to? What's the big deal?
Right. And then the fact that you have the denominational world, so Kelly Powers in that discussion that we had, he kept wanting to bring up the mikvah. And it's just, well, this is just some Jewish ordinance, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. And it's like, okay, but just because it's Jewish doesn't mean that it's ordained of God. And so, in fact, him knowing the secular history, he actually is trying to use that as an argument against what God has actually gone about to set up and establish. Well, here's just their Jewish tradition. And it's like, no, 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 no. This isn't that. So even with that, that's a tradition they had no business setting up.
It's along the lines of all the other things that they set up that we, if we don't know our history, we just assume if we're not studying Leviticus and what the law actually says, then we're not understanding
Right.
what God told them, where the Pharisees came in and said, oh no, we're going to add all of these things and therefore we're more holy because
Yeah.
of this. And then that gets us into the first century, and since we're not Jewish and we don't understand those things, except we go back and study it,
Mm-hmm.
then we're kind of at a loss.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And even when you consider the standpoint of the Pharisees, and the Pharisee means divided one, separated one. So what are they doing with this washing? They're adding an extra layer of separation between them and this supposedly, well, not supposedly, but this unclean group. And so you're just further making the barrier wider than what God ever intended, for it to be.
Who calls him Mike? We did it for so we first did the NACE class for evangelism, and we did one course on that, and then it was Mike from Mission Church. He
Oh.
was also using this,
That's right.
that Hebrew passage, well, they were washings, so he was using it as, it's a tradition of the Jews to get a Gentile in there using the mitzvah, whatever the washing hole is, and he was saying that that is where they would convert Jews or
Yeah.
make Jews, and so they are going back here and they're trying to say that's what it is now.
Yeah.
It's just an example. That's Morgan, whoever else they use. It's just an example. All the denomination people, but he was one that
Yeah, that's
we
right.
have to listen to because he was using the actual mitzvah or whatever the whole is.
Yeah. So I remember that. Yeah, I remember that now. And so yeah, but then like going back to Jamie's point, and that if you're not recognizing, so even with the Pharisees, they should have been recognizing all throughout their history. Whenever God's people did something wrong, and they then needed to be sanctified after doing that wrong, what did they have to do? Well, offer sacrifice, but before that, you have to wash. Washing has always been a part of God's sanctifying process, so that you can be able to either go before God or perform whatever it is that God is wanting you to do. Before the children of Israel went in to conquer the land of Canaan, Joshua tells them, rise up, sanctify yourselves. They had to wash before they could go and perform what it was that God wanted them to do. We're making sure that we're in a clean state so as to move forward. And then, but as we're saying with the Pharisees and how they end up taking something and moving it to such a degree that God never intended for it to be, can't we end up doing the same thing with some of our own doctrinal points if we're not careful? We see it all around with those brethren that don't want to eat in the building, the one cup, the one loaf, don't want to have classrooms, don't help orphans, widows, all that kind of stuff. And it's just, you're taking something and making an ordinance out of it that God didn't make an ordinance out of. So that's all, yeah. When we're thinking about how dangerous this information can be, if we're not tacking everything together, if we're not piecing everything together.
Is that why Peter would also make because the Jews are so used to this washing, that baptism is not for the...
Right, it's not the filth of the flesh. Yeah. So that section in 1 Peter 3, 20 and 21, and him making connection with it's not the putting away of the filth of the flesh. That's in reference to Jewish idea of sanctification. A lot of that stuff that you're washing under the Old Testament system is because you did something that made your body unclean, which was a representation. It stood in the place of your soul is unclean. So what are we doing? Well, you've touched a dead body. Okay, that's nasty. That's really gross. So you've got to wash. But that is also impressing that if this is something that's causing me to be unclean on the outside, to where I have to wash, not only me, I have to wash my clothes and any vessels, pots that touch the dead body, they've all got to be washed. And then I have to sit out however many days based upon what it is that I touch. If that's what's happening in this physical sense, then just imagine what's taking place in the spiritual sense. When sin is committed. And all of that is standing in the place of that, so as to impress on their minds of how bad this actually is. And then John comes on the scene. And now this is what he's presenting. And the Pharisees take issue with him doing this. Well, this is actually something that we've started implementing for Gentiles, and Gentiles that are of such a degree that they're needing this extra layer of cleansing. And now John is on the scene, and he's taking that, which they're saying, well, that's for Gentiles, they're heathens. And yeah, that's right. So this baptism, as we mentioned, is the beginning of the transition from the Old Testament system to that New Testament system that's going to be set up on Pentecost. And it's showing the inadequacy early. It's showing the inadequacy of the Jewish system, and that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. And that in order to be in that new system, we've already established in John chapter 1, you must be born again. That's Jew and Gentile alike. You're being placed on the same level. And that's the level of sinner. So even when we consider that element, and that this is what the apostles are being brought into. Okay, here's John, and he's practicing in this element that has now been set aside for these Gentiles. John is now performing for Jews what is common, or well, not commonly, but what's now being associated with Gentiles. What should that have done to the mindset of Peter, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Judas, in the work that they were going to be involved in doing? It's not just for the Jew. We're already tearing down the barrier between Jew and Gentile. But that kind of stuff takes time. And especially when you have been involved in this for thousands of years. And now all of a sudden, everybody's on the same level. Man, that's tough. And as we said, that's the whole discussion of the Roman letter. Well, the Jews, I thought the Jews were special. The Jews are special. But you're not so special that just automatically places you above everybody else. You have the law, you have the ordinance, you have the commandments. And those things are good. They're holy. They're spiritual. But all of that should have been pressing on your mind. The fact that you're given a law establishes that you're a lawbreaker. That's what Paul writes to the Thessalonian brethren. You do not give law to a righteous man. Righteous man doesn't need law. It's a lawbreaker that needs law. So everything about this is setting out this tone. We need a Redeemer. So they raised this question. Why then are you baptizing? John answered them, saying, I baptize with water, but there standeth one among you whom ye know not. He it is who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I am not worthy to unloose. These things were done in Beth Abara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. here's what is happening. That this baptizing, John answers, I baptize with water, but there standeth one among you whom ye know not. He it is who coming after me is preferred before me. The baptism that John is performing, he is setting the stage that this is not the final element. That in fact, you are doing this looking forward to what Jesus is going to provide. That's full cleansing. This water baptism was at the very start of this evangelism. That's important because any discussion after this point about redemption, salvation, being saved, being born again, has this as its foundation. It is automatically assumed that this is going to be a part of it. And it's pretty understandable as to why it would be the case. I mean, here they are, and they're even asking him, why are you baptizing? This is a frequent thing. This is what they're accustomed to him doing. So that when we get over to John chapter 3, and we have friends that try to say, well, baptism's not included in that discussion. What are you talking about? Everybody knows John is baptizing. The Pharisees come and they ask him directly about his baptizing. And then all of a sudden we get over here and you want to try to leave it out. And then you also notice that statement right here. There standeth among you, and is one whom ye know not. Here John is establishing he's right here in your midst. We're not looking for something in the future. These things are happening right here, right now. Now, this is an important, like when we're considering these elements, these kind of things help in the premillennial viewpoint of things. John is looking at these references, or at these events, going back to Old Testament references, and he's looking at those things and saying it's right now. And yet we have individuals, we have friends that want to take some of these same Old Testament prophecies and then want to try to move them in the future. No, this is referencing him coming later. No, John is referencing he's right here, right now. So when we have a inspired speaker or writer giving us these timestamps, we need to take it to heart. Right here in your midst, you knew him not. He it is who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I'm not worthy to unloose. So even though John is born before Jesus and his work is involved before Jesus, he's not the one. Yes, John is important, but when it comes to the ones coming after him, he's preferred. He's first. He has the desired position, and that I'm not even worthy to unloose his shoes. These things were done in Bethabara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John seeth Jesus coming unto him, and saith, Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, After me cometh the man which is preferred before me, for he was before me. And I knew him not, but that he should be made manifest to Israel. Therefore am I come baptizing with water. So just as Jesus said in the kangaroo court that took place with him, these things were not done in a corner. The things by which he's stating and teaching and things in which they falsely are accusing him of, it's all being done out in the open. And here's John further exemplifying that. Saw him coming, saith, Behold the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. Here is the forerunner making the announcement, saying it loud, saying it proud. Here is the sacrifice that the whole world needs. Notice, John doesn't say, "Behold the Lamb of God which taketh away the sins of Israel." Sins of the Jews. The world, Jew and Gentile alike. Here is the final lamb that all of the lambs that have been slain for thousands of years have been pointing towards. Going all the way back to Genesis 4 and that lamb that Abel offered, that he sacrificed before God, is setting the tone and leading up to this final lamb.
I would just make a little comment. When we hear this and we're saying of the world, and nobody's keying in on, hey, the world, not just the Jewish world, and then even still today in denominational circles, everybody's wanting to look at Israel as
Yep.
God's still chosen people.
Yep.
And from the very beginning, it's pointing us towards the world and pulling together everyone.
Yeah. And even, so even with the promises that were made to Abraham in the Old Testament system, and how that, yeah, these things are going to be given to Israel, like to this people that's going to come from you, but did God just forget about the rest of the world? No, he says, through your seed, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. So even
Surrounding Israel.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the problem. So even for us as Americans, we can get into that same type of dilemma to where we start, there's actually a meme going around on social media that, you know, it's the American idea of what the world looks like, and it's just the United States stretched out across the globe. We think the world is just all us. And it's not. There are other countries out here. There are other people out here. But we just get so high and mighty off of our, our own thoughts. In which to a large degree, the United States is one of the best countries to be in. That's the reason why you have so many people trying to come in here. But it's not without its flaws. And in recognizing that, well, yeah, we've got a lot of benefits here, we've got a lot of blessings here, but that just doesn't make us the end-all, be-all of the world, and especially of man's history. But that was the issue that the Jews had. Everything just centers around us. We're the only ones that God cares about. And of course, Jesus will set that record straight as we move forward.
It's because America wasn't there at that time.
That's right. Yeah. So here's the lamb that's for Jews and Gentiles alike. This is he of whom I said, after me cometh a man which is preferred before me, for he was before me, and I knew him not, but that he should be made manifest to Israel. There are signs, there's confirmation that's going to be coming about this man Jesus, that he is who he claims to be. Therefore, and he says this, therefore am I come baptizing with water. So John, the Apostle John, is going to give us some more information, some background of what is also made reference to in Matthew chapter 3 and about the baptism of Jesus. Verse 32, John bare record saying, so there's that term again. What are we doing here? We're building a case. A case for what? He is the Son of God. He is God's Son. He is deity. We're laying out the evidence. John bare record, saying, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it abode upon him. And I knew him not, but he that sent me to baptize with water, the same said unto me, upon whom thou shalt see the Spirit descending and remaining on him, the same is he which baptizeth with the Holy Ghost. With Matthew's record, Matthew records the conversation between John and Jesus, where John says, I don't need to baptize you, you need to baptize me. The response that Jesus then gives is that suffer to be so, that we may fulfill all righteousness. Okay, that's true. And that's a part of the reason for Jesus being baptized. But now John, the Apostle John, is giving us record that this baptism is also for the purpose of confirmation for something that was said to John. John says, I knew him not, but he that sent me to baptize with water, the same said unto me. So if Jeff Foxworthy were there, he'd be saying, here's your sign. Upon whom thou shalt see the Spirit descending and remaining on him, the same is he which baptized with the Holy Ghost. And I saw and bear record that this is the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ, that prophet. But he's not just that prophet. He is in fact deity. He is God's Son, and this is the confirmation of it. I saw it. I'm bearing record. Now, Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 3, not only do we have this taking place in this form and fashion, but when we're considering and saw and bear record that this is the Son of God. So here John says, I saw, but according to Matthew's record, didn't John actually hear something too?
This is my son.
Okay. There was a voice that came from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. So in both accounts, we have the statement and the recognition and the record being brought out. This is the Son of God. So John's baptism was to show Israel's need of a Redeemer. That's for that statement here. Here's the Lamb of God, come and take away the sin of the world. You need a king, but you don't need a king alone. You need a king that's also a priest. And that you need to have your sins dealt with. And that's what we have being set up. Here is the Redeemer that we have long been waiting for. And Jesus was baptized as a sign that He is, in fact, the Messiah. This is revelation being given to John. Then the record is given of things that happened in the following days. And I believe this is a 4-day record. So here's one day, and then it goes on to say, again, the next day. After John stood and 2 of his disciples, and looking upon Jesus as He walked, he saith, Behold, the Lamb of God. So twice, John's making the statement. Folks, people during this time frame, you do not need to miss this. I'm declaring Him unto you. Here's the one that you're needing. And it's just like, this guy? Why couldn't he be an Absalom? Long flowing hair and
Sandals and white
handsome to look at. Why couldn't he be a Saul who stood above everybody else? That's not what he's here for. He's a David. He's a shepherd boy. And it's him that you're needing to follow. So John will make the transition. The Apostle John will make the transition from John the Immerser having his disciples and then his disciples going out to follow Christ. And that takes place 37 to 39. And the 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned and saw them following, and saith unto them, What seek ye? They said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, being interpreted, Master, where dwellest thou? He saith unto them, Come and see. They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with them that day, for it was about the 10th hour. Here we have individual faith expressing itself. As Jesus is beginning his ministry and his work, the whole nation is not going after him. It's starting one by one. Here's two that are coming to him, and they express their desire. Okay, we're leaving John. Now we're wanting to follow you. We're wanting to be your disciples. And that is stated by them calling him rabbi. Rabbi, master, teacher. Okay, you're the teacher. We want to be your pupils. And thus that shift is beginning to take place. John is now beginning to fade out as Jesus begins taking the stage. But when we're considering that taking place, here's the forerunner. He's doing his job. Jesus now comes on the scene. Does that mean the forerunner's work is over? Okay, Jesus is now here and he's taking disciples. Does that mean that I get to stop?
Not until he's dead.
All right. John may not be center stage anymore, but John's work is not done, because John's work is to point people to the Messiah. So while we then begin to focus on Jesus, and rightfully so, what's going on behind the scenes?
John's focusing on Jesus.
John is now focusing on Jesus, and he's continuing to be involved in that work. And that's an important point for us to take into consideration, because just because I may not be center stage, does that mean that there's not some work for me to do? No. There's always work to be done. Huh?
Who are you hinting at?
Whoever needs it.
You pointing at me?
Did I say Jordan? So guilty conscience. But that's what we have taking place all throughout the Scriptures. Is that okay? Jesus is over here doing his work and John is still over here doing his. John doesn't stop what he's doing to now follow Jesus. Directly, I should say. John was still out involved in his teaching, his preaching, his baptizing, and then pointing them over here. Here's where you need to go. The work doesn't stop. Each one in their particular area going about and doing what needs to be done. And then we'll close with this thought. Jesus asking them, "What seek ye?" That is a really good question. And it's still a very good question for people today that would say that they have a mindset or a desire to want to follow Jesus. Well, what is it that you're looking for? Because what you're looking for may not be the actual thing that Jesus is offering. And there are a lot of people that have their own ideas about what it's like to follow Jesus. And they've not stopped to ask themselves, well, am I following Jesus to find something that I want, or am I following him to actually find what he has to offer? And that's the discussion in Matthew that's had about the disciples that come and say they want to follow him. Follow him. And then Jesus replies, you need to really consider what you're asking. The foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. Well, Jesus, I want to follow you, but let me go home and bury my father first. And the response is, let the dead bury the dead. So you see, there's that mindset that's coming about of, well, here's what I can expect, and here's what's actually going to happen, and the reality of it is far different from what we imagine. or even what we might have been taught in the past by teachers that we've had. The question is given, what seek ye? And the response after their response is simply, well, come and see. Here they are expressing they're wanting to become his disciples, and the answer was simply given, come and see. Experience. Investigate it. Just, all right, find out for yourself. And many people have their ideas about what the Church of Christ is all about. And that when we're thinking about our evangelistic efforts and how detailed they need to be per se, a lot of it can simply just come down to this. Well, what are you looking for? All right, well, come and see. Just come and look at it for yourself. And there's a lot of people, maybe not so much here, because the Church of Christ is not that well known in this area, but you head back east and you go through the south, a lot of people already have their minds made up about what they know about the Church of Christ. From what other people have said, materials that they've picked up and read, sermons that they've heard from denominational viewpoints. And all they really need to do is just, well, okay, I know you've heard some things, but why not just come and see for yourself? Come and do your own investigation and make your own conclusion. And there's a preacher story that circulates in sermons, so take it with a grain of salt as to how true it is, because it changes depending on who says it. But the commonality of the story is that there was an older gentleman who spent most of his life living around the corner from a congregation of the Church of Christ. He never went and visited, but from talk around town, he had built up in his own mind what he thought the Church of Christ actually was. And by some happenstance, can't remember exactly how it goes, but for some reason, on one particular Sunday, he decided, you know what, I'm actually going to go around the corner and just go and see what it's all about. And sure enough, he went and visited that Sunday, went back and visited a few more Sundays, and he found out what people were saying about it wasn't so. What he built up in his own mind about it wasn't actually the case. And then he ends up obeying the gospel. Just simply saying to people, come and see. And this is going to become a recurring theme as Jesus is going out and he's involved in calling his disciples and calling his apostles. This very phrase, just come and see. And a lot of times that's all it takes. And that's going to be the common theme when we look at Andrew in just a moment, but we'll stop there. Pick up with 40 next week. So I got close. I was 11 away. Yes, I did. Close is a relative term.
Doesn't matter if you win by an inch or a mile.
So any thoughts, questions on looking at John's baptism leading over to the calling now as the Lamb of God, and then now with the coming about of the apostles and the disciples? Yes?
Bill Engvall is the one.
No.
Yes.
Oh, you
Keeps
might be a
messing it
redneck.
up. Jeff Foxworthy.
Yeah.
That guy.
Yeah.
Do it every time.
All right.
you-
I do that, don't I?
Yes, you do, and I keep
Man.
telling you.
All right.
Repent.
Yeah. Okay, Bill Engvall.